Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 5 in our series as we conclude this series talking about the tribe of Dan and how they wandered away from what God had planned for them, how they chose a path of alternate obedience and ended up disobeying what God wanted and putting themselves in a bad place. As we talked about yesterday and kind of left off yesterday, this caused the tribe of Dan to lose their place. Once Dan resided at the northernmost extremity of Israel, the tribe just descended into full-fledged idolatry. They drafted Jonathan, this priest, this false priest that had initially encouraged them to do this thing that was against what God wanted them to do. They drafted this man to serve as their spiritual leader of the tribe. Jonathan and his sons led Dan in worshiping false gods the tribe had stolen from Micah's house. The writer of Judges made it clear, however, that the genuine house of God was in Shiloh, which was far to the south of Dan's new home. The tribe of Dan was both spiritually and geographically separated from God and his people. Not surprisingly, the distance from this would later cause spiritual disaster. Dan not only lost their place physically where they were, but they also lost their place in history. The tribe of Dan slipped further away from God during the reign of King Jeroboam of Israel. And according to 1 Kings, the king cast 2 golden calves for the people to worship in lieu of the true God. Jeroboam felt comfortable placing one of those calves in Dan, a place that had already demonstrated tolerance for a false religion. The king also expanded eligibility for the priesthood to include the lowest of people, which were not the sons of Levi. The prophet Jeremiah was grieved at this expansion of idolatry in Israel and proclaimed that God's judgment would come. He predicted that Dan would be invaded as punishment for their sins. And Jeremiah's prophecy would later become reality when the Assyrian armies invaded the 10 northern tribes, including Dan, and carried them away into captivity. Ironically, Dan suffered a fate similar to the one that they had inflicted on Laish. With this defeat, the historical story of those 10 tribes effectively came to an end. Dan, a tribe God had commissioned to serve as judges, suffered God's judgment instead. They lost their place and completely obliterated their purpose. So Dan lost their physical place, they lost their place in history, and they lost their place in the hereafter, in the future. While living in exile, the Apostle John saw a vision of the future and recorded, there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. Then in the following verses, John lists each of those tribes, curiously omitting the name of one of Jacob's sons. Not a single member of the tribe of Dan was included in the 144,000 that the revelator described as servants of our God. John offered no explanation for the omission, and all we're left with is this conjecture, this thing that while we do not know for certain why Dan was not included in John's list, the apostle did affirm that those who practice idolatry will be excluded from this heavenly city. Perhaps that explains why we find no mention of the descendants of Dan among those who were sealed by God. The tribe's disobedience and idolatry apparently led to their eventual exclusion from any eternal reward. Undoubtedly, they did not understand the ramifications of their decisions. They thought they were pursuing what was best for their people, but their actions proved the truth of a simple biblical observation. Proverbs 16:25. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. As we look at this and that last kind of part that we talked about, how they pursued something that looked good for them and for their family. Sometimes we can get so caught up in looking for something good for our family and looking to take care of our family that we walk in a way that's contrary to what God wants us to do. Just because it looks good for our family does not mean that it is. Just because it looks good for us does not mean that it is. If it's not in the will of God, we don't need to be going there. If it's not in the will of God, no matter how amazing it may look for our family now, it could be devastating for them later. We have to make sure that we are following the plan that God had for us. Jewish tradition asserts that the prophet Samuel was the author of the book of Judges. And there's a little thing that's written kind of in his perspective. And we see that Samuel, wrote the story of this disobedience. He wrote the story of all this, and maybe he looked at the situation of Dan and just thought to himself, this is just so frustrating. While the rest of Israel worshipped at Shiloh, the children of Dan insisted on following these twisted teaching of their own tribal priests. Samuel had prayed for them. He counseled their leaders, warned of God's eventual judgment, and grieved over their behavior, but it didn't seem to matter. This tribe persisted in their way against what God wanted. Their tribal religion was a cheap imitation of true worship. They made idolatrous replications of the Ark of the Covenant, the ephod and the teraphim, to make people feel secure in their sin. And when Samuel challenged them, they insinuated that he was little more than a tyrant on a power trip. Samuel knew that it would not end well for Dan. Regardless of how things appeared in the present, the tribe certainly had settled in a secure location, seemingly protected by surrounding mountains and all of that. Samuel visited there once and even understood the appeal, I'm sure, but he also knew those same mountains separated them from their brothers and would make it more difficult for the rest of Israel to come to their aid in the event of an attack. And by vacating their territory in southern Israel, where they were supposed to be, Dan allowed the Philistines and the Amorites to retain their foothold in that region, which would become more of a thorn in Israel's side, would become more of a problem down at the end. Dan's reckoning would surely come, the old prophet thought to himself. Their enemies would cut them off and obliterate them, just as they had destroyed Laish. God will not tolerate idolatry forever. As we go forward in our lives, and as we look at the story of Dan and kind of how this is wrapping up, and that outside voice that's there, Samuel seeing what is going to happen and trying to counsel them against it, we cannot be caught up in thinking that we know more. We cannot be caught up in thinking that our ways can possibly be better than or match up or eventually get us to God's ways. If we're choosing our own path, if we're not following the path that Jesus has set out for us to follow, we could end up in a place like this. I don't know about you, but I do not want to end up in a place like that. If it means that it's going to be a little bit more of a struggle for me and my family right now to have a better end, then that's much more worth it than feeling good now and ending up away from the will of God, ending up in a place I don't want to be, losing my family because I said this is better for us now. I don't want to end up in that place. And I hope that this lesson has touched your heart all this week. I know, maybe it seems like a little bit kind of a downer, honestly. It's kind of a sad lesson to read about, this tribe losing their promise and losing their place in God. But it's very important for us to understand. As we're going through these times and maybe these trials that are coming against us and things may get tougher, it's important for us to understand even more the importance of following the will of God and the direction of God, no matter what it may seem like, and not trying to find our own way or an alternate obedience, because that will just lead us down the path of disobedience and cause us to be further to God. I hope that this lesson has caused you to think and maybe caused you to do some soul searching and evaluate where you are and what you are doing. Is it in the will of God? Are you following the plan of God, or are you trying to find your own way? I hope that you will join us for service on Sunday. God bless you. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Take care.